To start with, just a couple of facts about the heart, and I've got a picture of a thoracic cavity of a cadaver there to the right. A little bit about it is a muscular organ. It's very dense with muscle tissue. Its job is to force blood to the lungs, to pump it so it goes throughout the body. So it has to be a very strong organ. It's about the size of your fist, if you can imagine that, maybe a little bigger or smaller depending on the size of your fist, but just gives you kind of a feel for how big that must be inside of your chest cavity. It's a little bit tilted off to the left, and when we build the structure in clay of the body system, remember that there was only on the left side of the body cavity 2 lobes of the lungs, versus 3 on the right. And again, you're not looking at that going, but Mrs. Pugh, it's reversed, and you're right, because remember, it's from the organism's perspective, not from your perspective. So in anatomy, left is right and right is left. So it rests right there on top of the left side of the anatomy. So let's add those layers to the heart. The outermost covering is called the pericardium, and it's the one that produces the fluid that reduces friction when the heart beats. Then there's the myocardium, which is actually the muscular layer of the heart. And it's the thick layer that the heart is actually made out of. And then you go inside, and there's a layer that covers where the blood touches the heart. So those inside chambers, and that's called the endocardium. And it is continuous with the blood vessels. So it would continue to flow through the blood vessels. All right, so let's talk about those chambers of the heart. Your heart actually has 4 chambers. Not all animals actually have 4 chambers to their hearts. Some animals have only 3 chambers, like a frog. So kind of an interesting thing there. There are 2 upper chambers, and those are called the atria, plural. If you're talking about only one of them, then they're called an atrium. So you have a left atrium and a right atrium. And then there's 2 lower chambers. Those are called the ventricles. And then there's a septum that separates the left and the right parts. So you can see this muscular septum right here in the middle. One way to remember that the top ones are atrium and the bottom ones are ventricles is A comes before V. So A on top of V helps to kind of remember that. The atria's job is just to collect fluid as it's collect the blood fluid as it's coming back from either the different parts of the body or from the lungs. It's a collection chamber, and then it contracts and forces the blood into the ventricles. The ventricles' jobs are what actually push the blood to different parts of the body. So let me go through. The ventricles are the pumps. All right, so notice that I've got this kind of color-coded here. So even in the diagram, the right side is blue, and again, left is right and right is left. It's blue on purpose. It's representing deoxygenated blood or oxygen-poor blood. It's coming back from the body. It's already dropped off the oxygen at all of the cells. And so it's colored blue here in the diagram, and I'm going to write about it in blue ink. If you happen to have a red and blue pen, that might be helpful to help you remember which one is which. If you don't, that's fine. Just thought it might be kind of helpful. Also, just wanted to get rid of any myth. The blood actually is not blue when it's in the right side. It is a slightly different color. It's not quite that bright red like when you're bleeding. It's a slightly different, more maroon, darker color. But it just helps to remember if you have the kind of the 2 sides colored very differently from one another. So the right atrium gets the deoxygenated blood from the body. And the blood comes into the heart through 2 veins. They are some of the biggest veins in the body. It is the inferior, meaning below, and the superior, meaning above, vena cava. And so that's how the blood gets into this upper chamber. If it's coming from the head or from the upper parts of the body, then it's coming in through the superior vena cava. If it's coming from the legs or the digestive system or anything below the heart, then it's going to come in through the inferior vena cava. All right, it goes through a valve that keeps the blood flowing one direction. We don't want the ventricle to contract and force the blood backwards into the atrium again. So it has a little valve, and that valve is called the tricuspid valve. Tri, because it has 3 parts to it, and that leads to the right ventricle. Now you might notice in the picture there's these little stringy looking things. Those are actually called the heartstrings. And so when might have heard a saying that's kind of romantic that someone's pulling on your heartstrings, well, your heart actually does have strings in it, and those strings in the Latin are actually called the chordae tendineae, and they are help to pull open that tricuspid valve and are attached to muscles inside the heart called the papillary muscles that help to pull them open. Okay, so the right ventricle gets the blood from the right atrium, and there's that word, papillary muscles, that connect to the tricuspid valve by using the chordae tendineae. Such a fun word to say, chordae tendineae. Those are the heartstrings that help to pull that valve open so that the blood flows into the ventricle. It sends the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary arteries. And so anything with the word pulmonary in it, you can think lungs. So from the ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve and out to the lungs. And it can go to the left lung or to the right lung. It doesn't matter. Kind of flows part to each different direction. So after they're in the lungs, they're going to, red blood cells are going to drop off the carbon dioxide. They're going to pick up the oxygen, just like we talked about with the respiratory system. And then the blood gets to the lungs through 4 pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins return the blood to that left atrium. And after they are in the atrium, they need to get to the ventricle. And now they're not going to go through a tricuspid valve, but a bicuspid valve. Just like a bicycle has 2 tires, the bicuspid valve has 2 parts to it. Sometimes it's referred to as a mitral valve instead of the bicuspid valve. And then that's going to lead to the left ventricle. Once it's at the left ventricle, it's going to flow through the aortic semilunar valve, which then leads to the aorta, and that sends it all over the body so that it can deliver the oxygen and, of course, nutrients that it needs to throughout the body. Now, the interesting thing about the heart is that left side of the heart is the walls around that ventricle chamber are actually 3 times thicker than the right ventricle. And if you've ever done a heart dissection, or if you want to take an anatomy class, that's one of the things that I love to have students do, is measure the thickness on that left side compared to the right side, because it has to push that blood to the head, it has to push it to the arms, it has to push it down to the legs, and so it is really much stronger than just pushing it to the lungs the way the right side does. So it's about 3 times as thick to help force that to go. The blood pumps to the body, and when you're measuring blood pressure, that's where they're getting the blood pressure from. It's the force from the left ventricle, and it's how strongly that pressure is being. Oh, here's the diagram that you have. It just has kind of these boxy looking chambers in it. I'm going to have you pause the video and draw the blue and red lines. If you happen to have a blue and red pen or a colored pencil or some way of distinguishing those 2 parts, that could be helpful. Not required, of course, but something, if you don't have 2 different red and blue, maybe a pencil and a pen, something that really helps to show the 2 different sides to that. And if you need to go grab it, pause the video, go grab that, and then be right back and start it up again. So trace that blood going through there, and then we'll talk about what all the different parts are for our most simplified version of the heart. So I'm going to start on the left, which is actually the body's right. So right is left, left is right. So from the body, the blood enters through the vena cava. And that is the vein that carries the blood to the heart. And you saw in the previous diagram, there's an upper one and a lower one, but we are just going to talk about the general pathway. Keep it really simple. The first chamber it goes into is the upper chamber. Hopefully you recall what the upper chamber is called. That's right, it's called the atrium, and since it's on the right side, I'm just going to abbreviate it RA for right atrium. Then it has to go through a valve, and that valve has 3 parts. So that is called the tricuspid valve, and it's going to go to the right ventricle. The right ventricle is the stronger of the 2 chambers, and there's your labeling of the tricuspid valve. Now, think about where it's going to go. It doesn't have oxygen, it's blue, so it needs to pick up oxygen. Where's it going to go? You're right, it needs to get to the lungs. And earlier I had said that anything that deals with the lungs has a word in front of it that means lungs, and it starts with a P. That's pulmonary. So it needs to go through right up here, this dark dash, and kind of in the middle of the picture. That is going to represent the valve of the pulmonary semilunar valve. That's then going to carry the blood to the left and the right sides, but again, we're keeping it really simple, to the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery is going to then carry the blood to the lungs. The lungs drop off carbon dioxide waste, pick up oxygen, and then are going to enter into the left side of the heart. Before we do that, pause this video and walk through the structures of the heart that we've already gone through. Just maybe do it once or twice so that you've seen the words. Goes to the vena cava, right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle, pulmonary semilunar valve, pulmonary artery to the lungs. Maybe do that a few times. Then it's going to enter into the left side of the heart from the lungs, and notice now I've changed colors. It's red oxygenated blood, and that's going to go into the heart through the pulmonary vein, and that's going to take the blood to the left atrium. It needs to go through a valve so that when the ventricle contracts, it doesn't send it backwards, and that valve is called the bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. Now, it's about to leave through the largest artery in the entire body. It's also probably the most famous artery in the entire body. If nobody knows any other name of any other artery in the body, they probably know the aorta, because the aorta is the largest one. And so I said that so that you would remember that the valve that leaves the left ventricle is called the aortic semilunar valve. And that leads to, of course, that largest artery in the body, the aorta, which carries blood all over the body. And there's actually a superior and an inferior aorta that goes either to the head or to the bottom half of your body, your legs or your abdomen. And then it's going to carry that oxygen-rich blood to the body cells all over the body, drop off the oxygen, pick up the carbon